Hey guys and gals, welcome to part 2 of our interview with Ian Thomson. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, make sure to go back and check it out. Or don't, and make this a choose your own adventure podcast. If you're looking to support the show, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. It helps you stay up to date with all of the latest episodes and helps us grow the show. That's enough of me, and now for the rest of the episode.
When you walked into that room, and it must have been pretty awkward, walking into a room and just seeing competitor. How was the rest of the evening?
Well, I left quite quickly, to be honest. It's almost like one of those short stories. I mean, I mentioned that Woody Allen film. It's just slightly ridiculous, these two biographers, but it's almost like a Henry James short story as well. Something so weird and improbable. I actually had encounters with the rival afterwards, once the books were published. So we both had to sort of talk them up at literary festivals in the UK. One time I remember in Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh Book Festival in Scotland. Afterwards, we both were given individual tables with piles of books, of our own books on the table, and people queuing up to have the books signed, at the two different tables. And we were like fishwives selling our goods, It was very sort of demeaning, actually, the whole thing. One thing I do remember that, and this is absolutely true, is that we both had to go on BBC television to talk about Primo Levi and about our books, our biographies. And just before I went on air, I was in the makeup room with a guy who was a member of a band that you may know called the Monkees.
Oh, sure.
Mickey Dolenz, I think his name.
Oh, yeah.
And he was being made up. He was touring the UK then. Whether as a solo artist or with other members of the Monkees, I don't know. But I couldn't get this song out of my head, which is, and then I saw her face, I'm a Believer, which I think Neil Sedaka wrote. But anyway, when I went out to confront my rival under the BBC studio lights, I had this wretched song by the Monkees going around my head, and then I saw her face. I didn't give a very good interview in the end, I think, but, I look back with some fondness on that moment now, I must say. But it's tough. I think that rival biographies pile up or tend to pile up in publishing when you have an anniversary of someone important, say, when Bob Dylan turned 60, there were a lot of biographies who sort of crashed the party. In my case, it was just sheer bad luck that there were these, that there was a rival on my back.
Right.
And it was grim. It was quite grim, I have to say.
Well, I don't want to keep on this subject because it's an unfortunate thing that happened. But interesting, I wanted to find out because you have so much interesting content. I've got to check that one out. As a matter of fact, after this podcast, I'm going to find that book on Amazon, I guess, correct?
It was republished recently with another title, which is called The Elements of a Life, because Primo Levi was a chemist. Mm-hmm. So the elements of a life refer to the periodic table, which is the chemist's stock in trade. And that's the edition to go for, if you like, the one you'll see on Amazon.
Okay, very good. So what about influences? Do you have any people that influenced your work? Who are they?
As a teenager, I read a lot of writers who were kind of outside the literary canon. A lot of American writers, beat writers, Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, transgressive writers like William Burroughs, Naked Lunch. I was reading Jean Genet, Journal of a Thief, these sort of books, Yukio Mishima, books that just weren't taught at school. I don't know whether they had an influence on me, but I still have an interest in beat literature and writing, and in jazz, kind of went so often with those writers. I'm influenced probably these days by a lot of American journalists who practice what we call long-form journalism instead. Writers like Terry Southern, Tom Wolfe, Joseph Mitchell, who wrote for the New Yorker, fantastic writer. His anthology of writings about New York, called Up in the Old Hotel, is a book that I recommend to my students at university, and they all absolutely love it. These are great sort of observational writers who kind of wrote, if you like, from the street. They captured an essence of the city from the street. I like writers who, I think, write about the city anyway. So that might be T.S. Eliot. It might be French writer Arthur Rimbaud, his Paris, or his the London of his poems, the Illuminations, his Illumination. I read a lot of French literature these days. So I suppose as material for the book I'm currently writing, which is a sort of half family memoir, half history set in the Baltic, I'm reading a lot of war correspondence works, first-hand witness accounts of bombings, roundups, deportations, quite grim stuff that, in a way, I covered in the Primo Levi biography, I have to say. And that maybe has a connection with the West Indian books, because they're about diasporas, about displacements, about people on the move, of which West Indian islands, of course, preeminently have histories made up of diasporas of one kind or another.
Yeah, doing the research, I was involved with drug addiction programs. I was on intake. The more I heard, like, okay, I thought it was the worst thing I've ever heard until I got the next phone call, and it emotionally drained me. I was depressed just doing the type of research that you do and hearing about some of these stories. And you're talking about the West Indies as well as some of these, well, throughout World War II, what was happening. Does that affect you emotionally?
I think on balance not, because somehow developed a sort of, I suppose, a second skin that doesn't allow any of this sort of grievous material to make inroads into my ordinary day-to-day life. So I don't cut, in cold sweats in night with sort of nightmares and things. Mercifully, because I think it would be quite hard to write about some of these things otherwise. And in the case of Primo Levi, although he was deported to the killing fields of Poland in occupied Europe by he was more than just a witness to contemporary barbarism, the death camps. He was a scientist and an essayist and a journalist and a novelist. He was many things. And that kind of helped me, I think, to sort of take the subject on board. The book that I'm currently writing now, which has been a long time in the writing, and I've dishonored my deadline so many times now from my publishing house, which is Faber and Faber, the eminent Faber and Faber, which of course is T.S. Eliot's publishing house. That they've sort of lost count themselves, I think. But with lockdown and COVID-19, I think it hasn't been so grievously terrible for some writers that we've just been able to hunker down and get on with the writing. In some way, there's nothing else to do, short of writing reviews and journalism and stuff, which I carry on doing. But I found the time and the confidence to get this book up on up and running. And I should explain that my mother, born in the Baltic, in Tallinn, which is now capital of Estonia, but in her parents' day was part of the Russian Empire. And she came to these shores to England in 1947 as a teenager. And I never knew that she wasn't English until I was much older, because she had reinvented herself to such an extent as an English woman, but she came across as an English woman, albeit with a slightly strangulated vowels and a very precise sort of received English pronunciation, which a lot of people, I think, from East Central Europe who came to Britain do have as a trait, because it's part of the assimilation into mainstream British life, is to forget the recent past that you've escaped and to assimilate into the host country to such an extent that you become part of it and become, in some ways, English. So it's a book, this one I'm writing now, about her past and my past, because the discovery of my mother's past is also, in a way, a discovery of my past. And it's about this area called the Baltic, which was part of a European sort of bloodlands in the Second World War, contested by both Hitler and Stalin, two apparently opposed ideologies, but in some ways very similar in what they did to these parts of the world, and the mass deportations of people from them. And it's an investigation, the book I'm writing, into what it means to be occupied 3 times. So first of all by Stalin, then by Hitler, and then by Stalin again, right up until the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall. France was occupied once, which is pretty bad for the future generations. But to be occupied 3 times is very corrosive generationally. And I'm looking at kind of what this means. It's a difficult book to write, though, because the problem here is how to marry the bigger picture, the history, with the sort of the smaller picture, i.e. the family history. And to get the balance right is not always easy, I think.
There's a very short film that I've seen. And now this was, and it stuck with me because my wife's family's from Lithuania. During World War II, there's an incredible, shocking film where you see this truck pull up and you see about 20 men go over to a mass grave. You see them starting to be shot, executed. And then there's somebody playing with a dog, throwing a ball, dog's coming back. It was shocking to me to see this film. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I still just think, whenever I think of Lithuania, this 2-minute black and white film of these people having to hop off this truck, go, they know they're going to die. And one of the soldiers is playing with a bloody little dog with a ball while all of this is going on. It was just incredibly, it just stuck with me. Anyway, you touched on COVID, and I was wondering about that. Like, did COVID help? You said that writers were able to hunker down. And I guess that is one of the positive things coming out of COVID right now.
I think so. And it's too early to tell what kind of great novels are going to come out of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know. With my students, I should explain that I teach at the University of East Anglia, which is in Norwich, in the southeast of the UK. I was teaching a book that was published in the 18th century by Daniel Defoe, the Journal of the Plague Year, and it's about the 1665 plague in Britain. But reading it today, it's uncanny how Defoe talks about social distancing. He talks about quarantining, talks about a mass exodus of people from the cities to the countryside. He talks about people in the streets giving each other a wide berth. He talks about the hope that there be some kind of magic cure, which was not then called a vaccine, but was something similar. He talks about slightly unhinged sort of religious fanatics shouting in street corners that the end is nigh, and that this is all, God's judgment on you poor sinning people, this pandemic. How similar it all is uncanny. So I think my students have kind of, in a grim way, have been very absorbed in this book, The Journal of the Plague Year by Defoe. And by the way, you asked about influences earlier, and Defoe for me was sort of one of the first journalists, and he's a tremendous writer. I absolutely love his work.
And again, I have not heard of that writer. What was his name again?
Defoe, Dafoe, and Daniel Defoe. He lived in London. Well, I suppose he's best known for Robinson Crusoe, the novel.
Oh, okay.
He was also a journalist, and the book he wrote on the plague, although he was only a child when the pandemic broke out, he interviewed lots of old timers who'd lived through it, like a kind of proper journalist, and gathered stories and looked at contemporary newspaper reports, and then fashioned this into an incredibly moving, powerful narrative, which has sold very, very well in Britain during the pandemic year. It's a Penguin paperback, Penguin Classic, but it has sold a lot because people want to know, they want to understand. There's a sort of grim fascination with pandemic.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go down this path, but yeah, I look at COVID and I see what different societies are doing, and I can't believe it. Canada's actually been quite tight. Like we've had lockdowns, we've had some controls, but it just I think we got to a point where we were 3 or 4 months into it. People started to gather again, and now we've exploded with issues. But in the States, like in Florida, going to football games, and I don't know what to expect. I would have thought that people would have just, let's do a 2-week lockdown or a 3-week or 4-week lockdown. Let's have only essentials working. And even at that, I'm not sure how you could just contain this virus. I don't know about you, but I think we've just gone about this completely the wrong way. And one of the things, I sell and I coach people on Amazon and e-commerce. My family has a factory in China, and one of the things that we manufacture is masks, which was way beyond, like, it just so happened, it's a coincidence. I know for a fact that the masks people are using are 100% ineffective. So I could put on a bandana, I could put on just a surgical mask. There's doing nothing for these people. And one of the things that's really bothered me is that I haven't seen, and I'm not sure if you've seen this, Ian, have you ever seen a commercial showing people how to not contaminate yourself when you use a mask?
Never.
And it's so simple. If you start touching your mask up here, you've contaminated it. Or, when to take it off, how to take it off. Ian, there's health workers that are going door to door helping people, and they take their mask off they just pull it off, put it in their pocket, put it back on, and they're wondering why people are getting this virus. Give that Daniel Defoe book to the politicians. Maybe they'll learn something.
Yes, well, that's right. Yeah, these are really very unsettled times, and I wish there was an end in sight, I suppose, because when the pandemic first took hold last March in the UK, there was, I would say, a kind of vague sort of among some people. This is going to be fun, it's like indoor camping. It's going to be sort of a challenge. We're going to enjoy it, and now there's just merely fatigue and a sense of sort of growing despair. It's very, very bad, grim times. But as I said earlier, I think that, for some people, it's not been as bad as it is for others. So for writers, maybe in some cases, if they haven't all gone mad, it's been okay. It's been more or less okay.
Did you have your family come back? But let's talk about your family. So your wife Laura, that you proposed in Haiti, and children.
Okay, so you've met one of my sons.
Yes.
And we have Henry, who's also a teenager. And then we have a daughter, Maud, Maud, and she is living away from home now with her boyfriend in North London. So we're all quite close to each other, yeah.
So Henry and Sydney are living at home right now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's okay. I don't know what the rules are in Canada now, but in the UK, it's pretty difficult to visit friends and things in houses. It's done outdoors, if at all, in small groups. But with my mother, who's 91, nearly 92, I make a point of seeing her once a week. She's a widow, but that I'm able to do that legally, as it were, because I'm part of a support bubble, it's called. I could be a care worker. She has care workers too going to see us. To all intents and purposes, care worker. It's tough.
It is tough. Same with my parents. I can't. I mean, they haven't gone out of the house basically since March, and they are in the States. I'm not allowed to go to the States to see them, nor would they have me in the house. But But anyway, yeah, it was bittersweet because we have 3 boys and they were away, and life is life. Usually they leave the nest and you'll see them occasionally. Kelsey was in Korea, Hayden was in Toronto at the time, but a professional musician, so he's everywhere. And then my other son was away, and then all of a sudden, boom, it was like, wow, this should not happen during my lifetime where I've got my boys back. And it was kind of interesting because so many things came out of that, which were a lot of fun. This podcast came from that. Anyways, then they went on their way again, of course, but it was a nice little 3 months of, wow, we're all together again.
So the I Know This Guy podcast grew out of the things.
I was having a cigar on our patio. I had 3 phone calls come in roughly in around 45 minutes. And one of the things that I said, common denominator, was, I know this guy. I've got a big network of people. And then I think it was either Hayden or Kelsey that said, you should make that into a podcast. Last thing I wanted to do was do any podcast work because I am terrified of being a host talking like this. Like if this was 2 years ago, this would not be happening. Anyways, we started off and we got our first one, then we got our second one, and then we were changing the format as we grew. And yeah, we've had, I don't know, Hayden, how many do we have now? 20, 30?
30 episodes out on the dock currently, and a bunch recorded.
But they're quite, you have to edit them afterwards, which is quite time consuming, I guess. Is it sometimes?
Oh yeah, just taking my ums and ahs and so's and all that out takes hours.
Yeah, really, right? Oh my God. I pity you then, but you got your work cut out then, haven't you, after the interviews?
Oh yeah, right. Hayden does.
It all falls on this guy over here.
I was just gonna say, so pre-COVID, so balancing a freelance lifestyle, especially in the arts, can be tricky. How do you maintain the balance between work, life, and family?
With difficulty sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the sort of boundaries between work and family life become very porous sometimes. And, I'm not very good at maintaining the distinction between work and as it were, family life. So one of my wife hates this, I know, is that if something's bugging me, and I'll take it to bed with me, actually have the piece of paper that I'm editing in bed, which I think a lot of writers, by the way, do. I've spoken to others, but that's not great in some ways. You should, and I can understand why some writers, if they can afford it, have a shed at the end of the garden or a flat somewhere else that they go and work in, and then they clock off at 6 o'clock as you would from a normal job, in an office, and come home, and then you leave your creative life behind for the night, But with me, it's not always been that easy. I'm better than I used to be, though. Much better. Because, it's nice to be with the kids, and, I'm with them all the time now on COVID, but, I do my best, I think, to make a distinction between home and work.
Right. Now, I should have asked this earlier on, but kind of curious, when you finish a book, does that give you relief, or does that make you feel a little depressed?
That's a very interesting question. I think a lot of writers have they go through a bereavement period when they suddenly don't have a project that they're working on. So, for example, when my Primo Levi biography came out in 2002, and it had taken me so long to write, so from the first interview to actual publication, almost 10 years, I was bereft. And I kind of, I was depressed. I wasn't at all elated, quite the opposite. And this can happen, I think. And I think writers, well, actually anyone who's involved in any kind of a big project, doesn't matter what it is, sometimes has to be wary of what they do when it ends, because what takes its place, Now I'm a bit more wised up about this. I'll have something in place, but I think it can be a dangerous period. And I think it depends on the sort of individual. But speaking for myself, I'm not sort of naturally, happy clappy sort of person anyway. I tend to sort of look on the darker side of things. So I have to be wary of sort of falling into these sort of dark places after finishing the project. Yeah.
You were talking about research and bags of these plastic cards. When do you know when you've got enough research? So, Haiti, Jamaica, just different books. When is enough enough?
Again, it's so hard to quantify that. I think that just instinctively, it's like eating a meal. You just sort of feel at a certain point you can't eat anymore. And it's a little bit like that with, for example, it might be the number of interviews you're conducting or the places you're visiting, whatever it might be, or the archives you're consulting. There sort of comes a point, I think, where you kind of instinctively know that more research at this point will be counterproductive. But I think that all writers, and particularly non-fiction writers, do more research than they need to. So at the end of a project, there's always a tremendous amount of material that's like lying on the cutting room floor. That you kind of think could be used often for a rainy day, for some other project, or could be sort of molded into a feature for a newspaper or a magazine or something. So nothing is ever kind of wasted. And I think if you understand that, then it's much easier to sort of stop. If you think, if you tell yourself that actually you're stopping now, you've got too much research, but you have to stop now. And anyway, it's not the end of the road necessarily, because you can use some of this material further down the line. That's kind of what I tell myself, really. But it's a sort of self-comforting sort of lie in a way, because of course you can never do enough research into a subject, realistically.
What about revisions? When you have to revise something and you've got all this content, do you find that your book changes, your idea for the book changes drastically because of revisions? Have you ever thought, okay, I'm going down this path, but because of these revisions, and you have a different vision for the ending?
Yes, I think usually in the sort of space between when you write what a publisher would call a proposal, like a synopsis, an overview of the book that you want to write. And that has to often be very detailed, because the publisher will give you the advance, the money up front, on the basis of that proposal. But very often the proposal has no resemblance at all to the end product, because you change midway through, And I've changed writing this book, the one set in the Baltic. I've changed. And one of the most extraordinary ways I've changed it was that I started off writing the book with the wrong parent. I should explain that my father, who was English, went to Tallinn on holiday and died there of a heart attack. This was in 2001. And I had to repatriate with my sister his body to the UK. Quite a complicated procedure, that involved embalming and zinc-lined coffins and all sorts of procedures and bureaucratic red tape. And I began the book with a description of my father's journey home from Tallinn to London. But once I've done this and made this, as I can now see, fatal mistake, the whole book was sort of doomed, because this wasn't supposed to be a book about my father, but for the most part, about my mother. So once I'd killed him off in Freudian terms, I killed my father off and started with my mother instead. The writing, which sort of took fire in lockdown, went ahead, sort of it gained fluency, it started to catch fire. But that was because I started with the wrong parents. So to answer your question, absolutely, a book can change very radically midway through, and sometimes for the better. Everything is realigned now. Start on the wrong footing, and very often the rest of the book, which you're trying to write, is wrong in some way, but you don't know why or what's going wrong.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't expect that. Anyways, yeah, that's a great answer. What about, we're getting closer to the end of the podcast. Interested in a quote that you might live by, or just something that's interesting.
Yes, this is a quote by the Polish Nobel Prize winner, Milosz. I don't know how to pronounce his first name. I think it's Czeslaw Milosz, who said that when a writer is born into a family is finished. I mean, he said this in a sort of slightly ironic, jokey way. And of course, I think he was talking, well, I imagine he was talking primarily about life writing, not fiction. So writers who choose to write about their family are treading on hot coals, because there's always going to be some emotional fallout. It's to do with who owns this story, who owns this family history, who has, if you like, a sort of stake in it, and who has the right to write about it. So the book I'm writing, while I hope it won't be a sort of hurtful exercise in family exposure or anything like that, I think inevitably will possibly cause some ructions within the immediate family, because these things are difficult. So Milosz meant that when you write about your family, it can be dangerous. And I'm pretty sure that he was writing primarily about non-fictional writers. And of course, he's written memoirs, I think, about his time growing up in what was actually part of the Baltic Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's always, I would say, a special risk when you put a parent or a family member in any kind of non-fiction, or what the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge called self-biography. He meant sort of memoir. Because those in the book don't always recognize themselves as they think they are seen by other people. And they don't like the mirror image that's held up to them in a book. And so they can get very grievously offended. Was I really like that? Was that how others see me? So it's difficult. I think in some ways we are, all of us, three different people: the person we want to be, the person other people see us as, and the person we would like to be. And in the space between all these three areas, there's an awful lot of scope for misinterpretation, mm-hmm. sort of things to go wrong. So I guess that's what Milosz meant when he said, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. But in some ways, although I said earlier it applies to non-fiction, it could also apply, I suppose, to all kinds of writing. Having a writer in a family can be a curse for the family. I think that some writers feel very, very guilty about books that they've written because mm-hmm. of sort of emotional fallout they've caused. And I can think of two contemporary writers who have had great difficulty with their families after books come out. So yeah, that was what I meant. That's why I chose that quote, because I think it's sort of particularly relevant to the book I'm writing at the moment. But maybe in the broader sense to writing full stop of any kind.
Okay. Let's talk about some hurdles that you've had to overcome, and what you've learned from them, and how you've applied that to your life.
I think a lot of writers have the defect of being perfectionists. So they can't proceed with a project until they think kind of psychologically that they've got it right. And this can be a tremendous sort of hindrance. And one thing I've learned, I think, is that the most important thing for anybody who wants to write anything is just to write it, first of all, get it all down, and then you can shape it, sort of panel bash it, do the surgery on it that you need to later on. But overcoming that psychological hurdle of the first draft not necessarily being the best draft or the right one or the perfect one, is something that's been difficult for me to learn, but I think I've taken that on board now. And I think another lesson I've learned is not to be too precious about your writing. I always tell my students that the most important key on your, word processor or laptop or whatever it might be is the delete key. I mean, I don't say that to be unkind, but I think that deleting, cutting out words, adjectives, adverbs, redundant sort of literary flourishes is very underrated. Stephen King, who's a novelist I admire very much, wrote a brilliant book on writing, where he says more or less the same, that you shouldn't be frightened of killing your darlings. You really have to delete, cut out, in order to let more oxygen into a narrative sometimes. Or to use another metaphor, for the boat to start to float a bit more, once you've thrown, jettisoned over a certain amount of dead cargo, then the thing starts to float and you get it into harbour. So I think that's one thing I've learned, definitely. And another thing, I guess, is not to give up the day job. So writing is not very well paid, unless you're Stephen King. And to have another kind of arm, and in my case, that's the teaching at university, teaching literature and reviewing work, journalism, as well as the actual writing, is very, very important. Sometimes journalism can be very counterproductive, because you can be writing your book, you can be steaming ahead, then you get a commission to review a book, and that sort of momentum that you'd started to build up is destroyed, because you're on another project. Suddenly you're writing 700, 800, 900 word review, and that derails you. I find that's quite difficult often, but I've come to accommodate, I think, better than I did in the past, the two sides of writing. So the sort of bread and butter sort of hack work, the journalism, and the actual book writing. It's not always easy to get that balance right, I must say. I think that could apply to anyone, not just writers, no matter what you do. So those are some lessons.
Okay. Now let's swing it around in successes. What would you consider your biggest success?
Well, I think you're kind of obliging me to blow my trumpet here a bit.
Yeah.
But of course, when a writer receives a literary prize, that's a wonderful confirmation that what they're doing has an audience, for a start, that there are people out there who want to read what you're writing. And it's a sort of confirmation that those English teachers I mentioned at the beginning of this talk with you, who were such an influence on me in the late 1970s in London, were right, that they sort of perceived something in me that was of value. So I think that The Dead Yard, the book on the Jamaica winning the Royal Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize, which is given to any work of writing. It can be a poem, it can be a work of fiction, it can be a work of non-fiction, so long as it conjures a sense of place. This is what it's given to. So long as it sort of conjures that sense of place vividly on the page, that's what the prize is given for. So for me, that was fantastic. Another prize for the Primo Levi biography was the W.H. Heinemann Prize, which in the UK was a very important prize for non-fiction. It doesn't exist anymore, but in its day it was. So that was very gratifying to receive that. And of course, some of these prizes are a lot of money, and I can't pretend that that's also quite useful sometimes if you're writing. It doesn't always bring in very much money.
Right.
And so the Ondaatje Prize allowed me to take my family to southern Italy, to Naples, which I did in August of 2008. But it was so hot that these poor children suffered in ways that I would never imagine. So I remember I took them to Pompeii, to Herculaneum, and they just went on strike, really. I'm not going any further. And in the midday sun, under this sort of very intense Mediterranean Neapolitan, this sort of pitiless son. It wasn't something they enjoyed very much, but talking to them now, they took a lot from it. It was an enforced holiday that Dad was hoping to introduce them to Vesuvius. We climbed the volcano. We went to Herculaneum and Pompeii. We explored all of Naples, a great sort of ramshackle, sort of crazy city. Really, I love it. And they took something from it, but maybe at the time it seemed like a penance, like some sort of punishment, But it was great to be able to take the family on holiday with that prize, So that's definitely a success for me. And of course, the book that you're writing now, you hope will sort of win comparable sort of plaudits and good reviews from the critical community. You have to take the brickbats. What's it called? The bouquets with the brickbats, or whatever the American expression is. Yeah.
I would think another success would be having your family on top of Vesuvius, looking out and saying, and that's where that imaginary island is.
Oh, yeah. I should have done that, yeah. Instead, what happened is that my youngest, Henry, who was very, very little then, had heard about the eruption of the volcano and just couldn't wait to get out.
Ah.
There was going to be another eruption imminently now. Yeah. Everybody run.
Yeah.
So we tore down Vesuvius like this crazy English family at great speed, But one thing that was beautiful about Vesuvius was the change in climate and temperature, because after the midday sun of Naples, which was sort of crucifying heat, Naples, as you got closer to the rim of the crater, was wonderfully cool. And there's a mist in the air, and so we all sort of relaxed and decompressed, and the arguments weren't so sort of vehement anymore within the family.
Well, all right, Ian, at the end of every podcast, we ask one question. Do you know a guy?
Yes. The guy I would like to nominate is called Colin Grant, and he is primarily a non-fiction writer. He wrote a wonderful book on epilepsy, which had been in his family. He wrote a wonderful biography of the Black Jamaican nationalist leader, Marcus Garvey. And he's written on Jamaica otherwise in lots of other places. He is of Jamaican ancestry. He has written a memoir about his father, who was this very extraordinary character, who had sort of black, baggy eyes from lack of sleep. So his nickname was Bag Eye. And the book he wrote is called Bag Eye at the Wheel. It's because his father was very proud of the car he had. So the book's called Bag Eye at the Wheel. And Colin Grant is a former employee of the BBC. And he has worked there until quite recently. He did his resignation and is now a full-time writer. And I know Colin a bit, but he's a very good writer. And I'd like to sort of put him forward as the guy that I know.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to talking with him. I think we're at the end. Wow, we touched on some really great topics today. And Ian, I've just got to, thank you for sharing your time with us today. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Hayden, as well. It was a great pleasure talking today. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
I know this guy.
That concludes our interview with Ian Thomson. Make sure to tune in next week for our interview with David Taborn. David is a British visual artist, and this was one of the funniest interviews I think we've done yet. I know we had a lot of laughs and had trouble keeping up with him sometimes, but we loved it. That's enough of me, and I'll see you next time.